In this video, you will learn how Caucasians serve in the army, why even officers and commanders sometimes treat them with caution, and where the stereotype that some of them allegedly refuse to wash floors comes from. In the republics of the North Caucasus, the opposite is true. Here, there are far more people who want to join the army than there are places available, and many young men see the army as a way to prove their masculinity, obtain social benefits, and raise their status in the eyes of their families and society. However, due to limited quotas, not everyone is able to join the army. Officially, the Ministry of Defense explains this decline in recruitment as a concern for balance and even distribution of personnel. Formally, the main criteria for selection are reliability, health, and education. But in reality, as those who have served admit, money and connections often play a decisive role. There are many cases where young people from wealthy Caucasian families literally paid to get into the army. This is a paradox, because in Central Russia, the opposite is often true. Conscripts try to buy their way out of service. The situation has changed significantly compared to the 1990s and early 2000s, when there were so-called black battalions, separate units where the majority of the personnel were Caucasians. These units had a scandalous reputation due to the high level of hazing, conflicts, and actual lawlessness. Now such battalions have been abolished, and the army recruitment system itself has become much stricter. Today, there are far fewer Caucasians serving in the army than representatives of other regions. They are rarely found in elite units such as reconnaissance companies, sniper groups, or special forces, where special discipline and trust from the command are required. Now it is even commonly believed that a significant proportion of Caucasians do their military service not in traditional army units, but in the Russian Guard. They say that more places are allocated to them there, but I cannot say this with 100% certainty. If any of you can confirm or refute this, please write in the comments. I served in one of those former black battalions, about which there are many legends. According to our senior officer, who began his service back in 1996, there was real lawlessness in the unit at that time. Imagine, powerful local groups of Caucasians formed entire castes within the unit. They kept the rest in fear, and their audacity reached absurd levels. The sergeant told how soldiers could light a fire and grill kebabs right in the barracks, ignoring both the officers and the rules. The weakest and most defenseless conscripts from other regions of the country, Siberians, Uralians, guys from Central Russia, were constantly under pressure. They were humiliated, beaten, forced to do dirty work, and, unfortunately, there were also cases of violence, including sexual violence. This was not uncommon for that period. The army of the 1990s was in terrible shape overall. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the old system had fallen apart, and the new one had not yet had time to form. Funding was meager, officers were paid pennies, equipment was rusting, and discipline was maintained only through fear. A particular problem was that many commanders were simply not mentally prepared to work in such conditions. Some tried to turn a blind eye, others tried to negotiate, but this had little effect on their Caucasian compatriots. They only recognized the language of force. Therefore, only a commander who could demonstrate toughness and strength deserved respect. We had one such ensign in our unit who was both feared and respected by everyone. He was known as a man who could easily smash someone's head with a stool for the slightest offense, and no one even tried to argue with him. These methods may seem barbaric, but it was thanks to commanders like him that the black battalions managed to maintain at least some order. Those were turbulent times for the army as well. Not only was the country's economy in decline, but the army itself was experiencing one of the most severe crises in its history. Hazing, ethnic conflicts, regionalism, and arbitrariness flourished in the units. Often, only the harsh, even cruel measures of individual officers and warrant officers saved the situation. If you happened to serve during those years, be sure to share your stories in the comments. Was there the same lawlessness in your unit? How did your commanders deal with the situation? Nowadays, the situation in the army has really changed significantly. There is much less violence compared to what was happening in the 1990s or early 2000s. Of course, it is impossible to completely eliminate cases of physical abuse. The army is the army, and there are hot-tempered commanders and veteran soldiers. But now everything is done much more cautiously. If they do strike someone, they try not to leave any marks. Any bruise or abrasion could lead to investigations by the prosecutor's office and military police, and no officer wants that. Incidentally, the warrant officer I mentioned managed to serve until retirement. He was appointed head of one of the services, where he no longer had direct contact with personnel. However, he still looked formidable. An eternally gloomy face, a huge scar on his cheek, a loud commanding bass voice, and a gaze that literally made the blood run cold in the veins of new recruits. I experienced this myself once when the warrant officer was looking for thieves who had stolen his duffel bag. When his eyes stopped on me, a chill ran down my spine, and for the first time I understood why even seasoned veterans feared him so much. Honestly, it wasn't me, but the feeling of guilt and fear came on its own, so powerful was his energy. Many may ask, why do you single out Caucasians from the general mass of soldiers? Are they somehow special? Isn't this a manifestation of intolerance? The question is fair, but it's not about my personal attitude at all. Caucasians in the army are singled out by the state itself. This is official practice, not someone's invention. First, the number of conscripts from the republics of the North Caucasus is being significantly reduced year after year. Formally, this is explained by requirements for reliability, level of education, or limited quotas, but everyone understands that the reason is deeper: the desire to reduce the risks of conflict and regional groups. Second, every political officer or person responsible for educational work in a unit has a special list. It is called Servicemen of Caucasian Nationality. It records absolutely all soldiers and even officers from the Caucasus. I have seen this list with my own eyes in our unit, and I assure you, it is real. Thirdly, Caucasians themselves often form strong regional groups. It is in their blood to stick together, help each other, and support their fellow countrymen in any situation. For them, this is natural and right, but for the Army collective, it results in division, us and them. Caucasians often try to live more autonomously, staying within their own circle, and in doing so, they unwittingly distance themselves even more from the other soldiers. At least, that's how it looked to us. Of course, the situation in each individual unit depends directly on the commanders. If the commanders are weak, unable to maintain discipline and nip disorder in the bud, then absolutely everyone starts to get out of hand. Caucasians, Slavs, anyone. The army is very simple in this regard. Where there is no firm hand, chaos ensues, and impunity invariably breeds indifference and a complete disregard for service. Those who have already completed their term of service understand perfectly well that these are not empty words, but the harsh truth. Caucasians in the army do indeed have a special status. And it's not even a matter of nationality, but of the system itself. If there is a group of Caucasians in a unit, a corps is almost always formed around which a certain hierarchy is built. It includes those who bow to their authority. It does not matter what category of military personnel we are talking about. They can be privates, sergeants, and sometimes even officers. Some, lacking the strength or desire to engage in conflict, prefer to give in, to take the headache off their shoulders. As a result, some people find themselves in a subordinate role, and Caucasians use this as a way to demonstrate their superiority. For example, there were 2 companies in our KMB. In the first, 70% of the personnel were Caucasians. In the second, there were practically none, at most 2 or 3 people. The difference was immediately and very strongly felt. The second company lived strictly by the rules: wake up, exercise, discipline, drill training, equality among all soldiers. There were no castes there, everyone lived as one. If someone broke the rules, they were punished by the sergeant or commander, and everything was crystal clear. Even Muslims from the Volga region or Central Asia behaved like everyone else in this environment. No one was allowed to stand out. But in the first company, the rules worked much worse. There, the sergeants and officers were simply physically unable to cope with the unruly personnel. Many Caucasians felt like they were in charge. They walked around with phones, which were actually prohibited. They didn't wash the floors, shifting this responsibility onto others. They ignored orders. And if a sergeant tried to restore order, it turned out that it was almost impossible to get a Caucasian to follow orders. Either he openly resisted, or he simply found a weak-willed soldier of another nationality and forced him to carry out the task. Why is that? There are several reasons. First, physical training. Many Caucasians have been involved in sports since childhood, especially wrestling or boxing, and this automatically gives them an advantage among conscripts. Second, camaraderie. They always stick together and support each other in any situation. This creates a group effect, where one stands for all and all stand for one. And thirdly, some of them really do have influential relatives behind them, an uncle in the police, a brother in the FSB, a father with epaulets. Not only can you get punished in the army for even the smallest thing, but there are no rewards here, as we know, only constant restrictions. But there is one curious point. After completing basic training, Caucasians are usually not assigned to the same companies in large groups. They are deliberately divided into small groups of 2 or 3 and distributed among different units. This is done for a reason, because officers understand perfectly well that a large number of Caucasians in one company is a real explosive mixture. The reason lies in psychology. Individually, many guys from the Caucasus behave quite calmly. They are balanced, submissive, try not to stand out and not to provoke trouble. But as soon as they get together in a group of at least 5 or 6 people, everything changes. They begin to feel more confident, behave more recklessly, their level of self-control decreases, and their emotions take over. And then various conflicts, skirmishes, demonstrations of strength, and aggressive behavior become inevitable. That's how it was with us. As soon as we arrived with the KMB at the combat unit, the Caucasians of our draft immediately tried to subjugate everyone else. At first, this was expressed in small things, forcing someone to wash the floor for them, give up their ration or place on the nightstand. But pretty quickly, everything escalated into open confrontation. In the end, it ended in a mass brawl involving almost the entire company. The commanders, of course, tried to restore order, but they were unable to completely defuse the tension. Therefore, throughout the rest of our service, such clashes of interests flared up again and again. However, the situation changed dramatically when most of the company left on another mission. Only 10 people remained in the unit, among whom there was only one Caucasian, and it was the very one who had previously been considered the main instigator of all the fights and conflicts. And then something amazing happened. Without his support, this guy behaved completely differently, calmly, appropriately, and restrainedly. Moreover, I remember a case when he actually cried while watching TV. There was some program about love, and it touched him deeply. We were all sitting together, drinking tea, talking about religion, traditions, sharing our views on life, and there was no aggression. Everything was humane, peaceful, and even warm. But, of course, the army is still the army. And one day, in front of the whole company, I had a conflict with this same Caucasian guy. We got into a verbal fight, and he, without hesitation, began to threaten me publicly and very emotionally. Then the two of us went into the drying room alone. And, as often happens, of course, no fight broke out. The tone of the conversation immediately changed. It became calm, without aggression or undue pressure. We talked frankly, shook hands, and calmly went our separate ways. This was because there were no spectators in the drying room, his brothers, in front of whom he usually had to demonstrate strength and leadership. When there is no audience, the need for ostentatious bravado disappears. And then, from behind the formidable authority, a very ordinary guy emerges, with his own character, but also with inner balance. In fact, it's not that they can't do anything one-on-one. They can, and how? But here another side comes to the fore, the human side. Inside each of them is an ordinary young guy, someone's son, someone's grandson, who has ended up in a harsh male collective and, due to the peculiarities of his mentality, does not want to appear weak. Therefore, in public, he is forced to constantly demonstrate his superiority, maintain his image, and be above others. This is, in essence, a defense mechanism that many guys from the Caucasus have had since childhood. Let's not delve too deeply into psychology, but it is worth noting that it is these characteristics that create a visible contrast between Caucasians and other soldiers. In the realities of army life, another important factor is that the stereotypes about the hot temper or strict discipline of Caucasians are actively used by the commanders themselves. and they often do so in a very pragmatic way. For example, if a company is assigned to perform certain tasks, such as unloading, cleaning the area, or digging trenches, for some reason, a Caucasian is often appointed as the leader of this group. This is not because he is more intelligent, responsible, or experienced. It's much simpler than that. Weak commanders know that they won't be able to get him to work on an equal footing with the rest. He won't carry bags or dig the ground himself, but he will be able to make others work faster. And he will do so in such a way that the task will actually be completed on time and with the desired result. This is because almost half of the company subconsciously fears him. And this fear is not so much physical as psychological. With his loud manner of speaking, imposing authority, and strict demands, the Caucasian is able to quickly establish discipline around him. As a result, it is convenient for the commander. He appoints a senior officer, and the job is done. The work gets done, order is maintained, and he himself may not even have to intervene. At the same time, such soldiers also occupy a special place in everyday life. Caucasians often turn out to be quite useful members of the team. They are more likely to get the sweet jobs, for example, in the kitchen, in the supply department, or in other units where the workload is lighter and there are more opportunities. They often take on positions as actors, instrumentalists, or other sweet specialists, where, as a rule, it is not necessary to dig too deeply. They make few mistakes, and those who work alongside them find it much easier to serve. All this is due to various adjustments and peculiar concessions that they know how to get for themselves. As for punishments, the situation here is even more interesting. For Caucasians, they are by default milder than for all other soldiers. Personally, I have never seen commanders individually tear into a Caucasian, yell at him, or, even more so, publicly insult him. On the contrary, they were treated with more restraint and caution, as if they were afraid of the consequences. But with the rest of the soldiers, yelling, humiliation, and drill sergeant reprimands were commonplace. Practically all the Caucasians I served with were caught stealing in one way or another. But it is important to clarify here that stealing was not considered rat-like behavior among them. On the contrary, it was often disguised as harmless borrowing without asking. Like, he didn't steal it, he just borrowed it for a while. It's like it's no big deal. Let me give you a specific example. One night, my shoe polish disappeared from my nightstand. I started looking for it all over the barracks and noticed the shiny, polished boots of a Caucasian guy. I asked, "Where's my shoe polish?" And he replied calmly, "I didn't take it, I just put it in another guy's nightstand." So not only did he secretly steal the item, but he also managed to frame someone else. There were other situations as well. For example, the Caucasians in our company were selling insignia that they had stolen from other people's peacoats. Every visit to the mess hall turned into a little hunt for other people's chevrons. And on the day of discharge, when several Caucasians were leaving for home, 9 phones disappeared from the company at once. Coincidence? Personally, I highly doubt it. Indulgence was evident in literally everything. In terms of discipline, if a Caucasian behaved inappropriately, no one was particularly surprised. On the contrary, many even justified such behavior. Well, he's Caucasian, he's hot-blooded, that's how they are. As a result, his actions were often simply overlooked. For example, if a Russian soldier was late returning from leave, he would be punished. And not only personally, the command often canceled leave for the entire unit. As a result, the entire team began to look askance at this soldier, because everyone suffered because of his mistake. He was immediately subjected to collective pressure, sidelong glances, ridicule, and additional educational measures. If a Caucasian found himself in a similar situation, the reaction was completely different. They might not say anything to him at all. At most, he might receive a verbal warning. But a week later, he would calmly go on leave again, as if nothing had happened. The team had no complaints about him, they were afraid of him, and the officers preferred not to get involved so as not to provoke a conflict. It was even more evident with daily chores. A Russian who refused to wash the floor was immediately put under pressure. He could be broken with beatings, trained to exhaustion, push-ups, and squats until he agreed. Even if such a soldier was sent to the front, upon his return he was still broken, again with drill, ridicule, and pressure until he finally gave up and became obedient. But no one beat up the Caucasians. The maximum they could give them was 10 days on the front line, but even after that, they returned to the unit with a completely different status. They were greeted like heroes. "Well, tell us what happened there, how you served, what and how." In the eyes of their colleagues, they did not look like they had been punished, but rather like they had undergone a special trial. After that, trying to force him to do anything was useless. He returned even angrier, with an even greater aura of power, and even his commanders were afraid to touch him. I would like to note another point. Among the Caucasians in the service, there were also completely ordinary guys who did not seek to assert themselves at the expense of others. They differed only in their rare surnames or accents. For some time, I served in the same company with a lesbian, and this guy was a real phenomenon. First, he was very different from other Caucasians in his upbringing. Second, his surname spoke for itself. He was the son of a local general. When the officers saw his surname in the documents, even the brigade commander's voice changed, becoming softer and more cautious. And when his father came to visit his son, the whole battalion was literally on pins and needles. They prepared, tidied up, and bustled about. But the most interesting thing was that despite his family's enormous power and status, this guy behaved completely differently than expected. He was also appointed senior in the ranks and at work, but unlike most, he did not shift tasks onto others, but worked on an equal footing with everyone else, and sometimes even more. He was never too proud to pick up a rag or a broom, sweep the deck, mop the floor, or help his colleagues with some small household chore. And this despite the fact that, with his connections, he could have shown up at the unit once a week and spent the rest of his time on leave or under his father's wing. But no, he served on an almost equal footing with the rest. Yes, unlike most, he did have certain privileges. He went on leave every week, he hardly ever had to stand guard, and he always had an abundance of food from home. However, compared to how some other Caucasians behaved, loudly demonstrating their superiority, he was a true role model. The most interesting thing is that he did not seek to communicate with the other Caucasians in the unit. He didn't jump around, shout, organize noisy gatherings in the barracks, or try to prove who was the boss. On the contrary, he seemed to consciously keep his distance from this hot-headed brotherhood, trying to behave as modestly as possible so as not to cast a shadow on his family name and his father's name. Apparently, he understood perfectly well that any inappropriate behavior on his part would be perceived not only as his personal misconduct, but also as a disgrace to his family. Therefore, he tried in every way not to stand out, to be one of the crowd rather than above everyone else. At the same time, his commanders treated him with special respect. Some of them openly fawned over him, afraid to raise their voices or make a comment. But he himself never took advantage of this. He always strictly observed the chain of command, stood in line as required, carried out orders, and even helped other soldiers if he saw that someone was struggling. And at such moments, many thought to themselves, "Here he is, a truly worthy representative of his nationality." Such a person would never call someone a churka or insult them with other words. But there was another Caucasian serving in the same company with me, the complete opposite. He was a real piece of shit who did nothing but bully the new recruits. He liked to assert himself at the expense of the weak, forcing them to address him as Comrade Corporal, as if he were not a conscript but at least a general. He constantly demanded respect from the young recruits, which in reality amounted to nothing more than humiliation. Many put up with it, afraid to get involved, because he had the support of his fellow countrymen. But in contrast to that well-mannered and calm guy, it was clear that it wasn't a matter of nationality, but of the specific person and his upbringing. I know that many representatives of Caucasian nationalities are watching me, but I want to address not only them, but all viewers in general. Guys, remember this information and draw your own conclusions. In the army, and in life, everything depends on how you behave. If you behave with dignity, you will be treated with respect. If you behave like scum, then you will be treated accordingly, no matter how famous you are or how hot-blooded you claim to be. The most important thing in any situation is to remain human. Then everything will be fine.